After nearly 30 years, JonBenet Ramsey's family is still fighting for answers. She was 6 years old. She loved dressing up. She loved performing. She loved making people laugh. And on the day after Christmas in 1996, her body was found in the basement of her own home. Almost 30 years later, no one has ever been arrested. No one has ever been charged. And the family she left behind is still begging investigators to use the DNA technology sitting right in front of them. This is the real story of what happened to JonBenet Ramsey, what her family has said about it in their own words, and why, after 3 decades, the case is suddenly moving again. JonBenet Ramsey was born in 1990, the daughter of John and Patsy Ramsey, and by the time she was 6, she was already a familiar face on the child beauty pageant circuit in Colorado. She was bright, energetic, and by every account from people who actually knew her, a kid who genuinely loved being on stage. On the morning of December 26, 1996, Patsy Ramsey woke up, went to check on her daughter, and found her bed empty. Instead of JonBenet, she found a handwritten ransom note on the staircase, nearly 3 pages long, demanding $118,000, an unusually specific number that, oddly, was close to a bonus John Ramsey had recently received. Patsy called 911 in a panic. Police arrived at the house within the hour. What happened next is one of the most heavily criticized parts of the entire case. Instead of treating the home as a crime scene from the first minute, officers allowed friends, neighbors, and clergy to move through the house over the following hours. Evidence was walked over, touched, and in some cases lost entirely before anyone realized how badly the scene needed to be locked down. For nearly 6 hours, no one searched the basement. It was John Ramsey himself, acting on a detective's suggestion to look around, who went downstairs and found his daughter's body. He carried her upstairs before investigators could examine the scene where she was found, a decision made in a moment of unbearable grief, but one that forensic experts say permanently damaged the case. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house, which almost immediately turned suspicion toward the family instead of an outside intruder. Within days, the story exploded into a national obsession. Pageant photos of JonBenet, the makeup, the hairstyles, the costumes, were splashed across every tabloid and news broadcast in the country. The image of a 6-year-old dressed for the stage sat uncomfortably next to the horror of her death, and the public reacted by turning that discomfort into judgment. Patsy Ramsey, in particular, became a target, with commentators speculating, without evidence, that she had somehow been involved. John and Patsy were formally named suspects by the Boulder police, a designation that followed them for years, even though they were never charged with anything. For the Ramsey family, this meant grieving the murder of their daughter, while simultaneously being treated by much of the public, and by investigators, as suspects in her death. John Ramsey has spoken about this many times over the years. The isolation, the accusations, the sense that instead of hunting for the person responsible, law enforcement spent its early energy building a case against the people who had just lost a child. He's described trips to the grocery store turning into ambushes, tabloid headlines naming his family before any evidence existed, and the toll all of it took on his marriage and on his other children. Burke Ramsey, JonBenet's older brother, was only 9 years old when his sister was killed. He was in the house that night, and because of that, he became a subject of public speculation almost immediately, despite there being no evidence connecting him to the crime, and despite the fact that he was cleared through DNA testing years later. For nearly 2 decades, Burke stayed almost entirely out of the public eye. His parents tried to shield him as much as they could, but he's spoken about seeing his own name in newspaper headlines as a child and not fully understanding why. In 2016, 20 years after his sister's death, Burke gave his first and, so far, only extended public interview, sitting down with Dr. Phil McGraw across 3 broadcast segments. It remains the only time he's spoken publicly at length. He chose not to participate in a more recent documentary about the case, citing years of harassment from online amateur investigators. In that 2016 interview, Burke directly addressed the theories that had followed him for 2 decades. He denied any involvement in his sister's death, saying he didn't understand what more evidence people needed. He talked about that Christmas season, about waking up the next morning to chaos in the house, and about being told his sister was gone. He described going to her funeral and staring at the casket, still processing, as a child, what death even meant. He talked about the strange sensation of being both a grieving little brother and, at the same time, a name whispered about by strangers who had never met him. Body language analysts who reviewed the interview afterward were divided on how to read his expressions, and it's worth being honest here. Reading nervousness or discomfort in someone's face is not evidence of anything. Burke Ramsey has never been charged with any crime, and DNA testing conducted in the case has never linked him to it. The turning point that actually changed the official record came in 2008. Boulder's district attorney at the time announced that DNA recovered from JonBenet's clothing, from an unknown male, did not match any member of the Ramsey family. Based on that evidence, the DA's office formally and publicly cleared John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, and Burke Ramsey of any involvement in the murder. The office even issued a written apology to the family for the years they had spent under suspicion. For John Ramsey, it was a moment of vindication but not resolution. Being cleared told the world who didn't do it. It didn't tell anyone who did. Patsy Ramsey never got to see whatever comes next in this case. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the years after her daughter's death and died in 2006, before the DNA exoneration was even announced. John Ramsey has spoken about the particular pain of that his wife spent the last years of her life under public suspicion for a crime she didn't commit and died without ever knowing who took their daughter from them. Since then, John Ramsey has become the case's most persistent advocate, and his argument is a straightforward one. DNA science has moved dramatically forward since 1996 and even since 2008, and the evidence sitting in the Boulder Police Department storage should be run through modern forensic genetic genealogy, the same category of technology that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018 after more than 40 years at large. That case showed the world that genetic genealogists can sometimes generate leads from partial or degraded DNA samples that traditional matching could never touch, by comparing genetic markers against public genealogy databases to build out family trees and narrow down a suspect. Ramsey has pushed for years for Boulder police to allow an independent, specialized lab to test evidence like the ransom note, the cord used in the killing, and other crime scene material using these newer methods. For a long time, his message was that the department was slow-walking that process, and in past years he even asked Colorado's governor to intervene. That pressure appears to be paying off. In January 2025, Ramsey met for nearly 2 hours with Boulder's new police chief, Stephen Redfern, along with the district attorney's office, bringing his own outside DNA expert to the meeting. He came away from it more hopeful than he has in years, telling reporters he was impressed by what he described as the department's new leadership and its openness to using cutting-edge testing. In the department's most recent annual update, released in December 2025 as the case approached its 29th anniversary, Chief Redfern confirmed that detectives had conducted new interviews, re-interviewed people based on fresh tips, and collected and tested and retested physical evidence using modern DNA techniques. He was direct about it. Technology in this field keeps evolving, and that's especially true for DNA testing. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation has also confirmed it is working through evidence from the case, though officials caution that some of the recovered DNA is a complex mixture from more than one person, which is still difficult to fully separate even with today's tools. None of this means the case is close to being solved. Investigators have been careful not to overpromise. But it's a real shift from where things stood for much of the previous decade, when the Ramsey family's public message was mostly frustration, that evidence was sitting untested, that the same detectives who had once wrongly suspected the family were reluctant to admit new approaches were needed, and that years were passing without any forward motion. Now, for the first time in a long time, both sides are describing an actual working relationship. What's often lost in the true crime retelling of this case is how ordinary and devastating the loss at its center really is. JonBenet Ramsey would be approaching her mid-30s today. She was, by every account from people who knew her outside of pageant photographs, a funny, energetic little girl who liked performing and liked making the people around her laugh. Her family didn't get to watch her grow up. Her father has said, in more than one interview over the years, that if he could say one thing to her now, it would simply be that he's sorry. Sorry he couldn't protect her, because that was his job. That's not the language of someone chasing a media narrative. It's the language of a parent who has spent nearly 30 years without an answer. The case remains formally open. Boulder police have said repeatedly that it is still an active priority, not a closed file gathering dust, and Chief Redfern has specifically asked anyone with knowledge of the crime to come forward, even now, saying it's never too late. Investigators have followed more than 21,000 tips over the life of the case and interviewed, well, over 1,000 people across 19 states. Retired Detective Lou Smith, who worked the case early on and became convinced an intruder was responsible rather than anyone in the family, spent years after leaving the official investigation continuing to build out his own list of possible suspects before he died in 2010. His daughter has said she's continued that work in the years since, hoping it might one day connect with an unidentified DNA profile from the case. Whether new DNA testing ever produces a name is impossible to predict. Forensic genetic genealogy has cracked cold cases that seemed permanently unsolvable, but it depends on usable genetic material and on that person's relatives having tested with consumer genealogy services, conditions that don't exist in every case. What can be said honestly is this. The Ramsey family was formally and scientifically cleared of any involvement in 2008. The case has never been closed, and as of the most recent update from Boulder Police, evidence is actively being tested and retested using technology that didn't exist when JonBenet died. For a family that spent years being told to wait, that alone is more than they've had in a long time. Whether it's enough to finally answer the question that's haunted them for almost 3 decades is something only time, and the evidence itself, can tell. If you found this rundown helpful, let us know in the comments, and subscribe for more deep dives into cases that are still being actively investigated.